Hey everybody, welcome back to another part in my Creating a Great Tone series for our Line 6 Helix. Today I'm going to do part 2 of what I feel is the most important video that I've done yet in this series. This is the second part in the series on the discussion around gain staging. Now if you haven't watched my first video in the series, please go do that. But I got a lot of great feedback from it and a lot of questions, a few people trying to argue about a few things. But I wanted to go a step further because in the first video, I kind of covered basically the underlying ideas about gain staging. You know, maximizing signal to noise ratio, avoiding distortion, avoiding negative consequences of maybe too hot a signal, right, or too low a signal. Meaning maybe digital distortion from having too hot a signal to very bad signal to noise ratio by having too low a signal. And I debunked a few myths that are floating around out there about what the proper way is to set it. And this is the funny thing, you say the proper way to gain stage. And this is why I have to do this video, because it's much more complex than just saying, well, this is the way you do it always, and that's the way it is, because as we all know, I'm dealing with the Helix here. The Helix is a very complex piece of equipment with a lot of complex signal routing possibilities. So when we have a very simple signal chain, there's really not a lot to worry about. We want to maximize our signal to noise ratio and we want to avoid distortion, clipping, digital clipping. But when we start adding different blocks in and more gain stages, it gets a little more complex. Now, what if I was to tell you that not all effects blocks in the Helix are created equal? What if some of them were actually designed and modeled to mimic added distortion that we may or may not want? Not necessarily meaning we're going, hitting them with too much signal or hitting them with too little signal, but just to mimic the real world version, the hardware version of whatever it is modeling. A lot of old gear, and I mentioned this in the first video. I basically summed it up by saying, the proper level to go into the next block is whatever gives you the desired result. Sometimes maybe we want to take advantage of some of this modeled distortion in a block. Maybe sometimes we don't. That's when it comes down to using our ear. But to state that we're hitting it too hard because there's distortion, that may be the desired outcome. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So to get into this though, and I'm using a very different methodology today, well, not very different, but a much more streamlined setup that I did in the previous video. We need to talk about effects blocks that are going to be linear or non-linear. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me sum it up kind of in the best layman terms I can describe. A linear effects block is meaning that the type of processing it does, the way that it changes the sound is not going to be dependent on how much input is going into it, okay? So something like a simple gain block, it's not designed to add or subtract anything to the sound like distortion as we hit it harder. It's just designed to boost the volume up. So meaning if we go into one gain block, boost it by 5 dB, go into another gain block and drop it by 5 dB, it should just cancel itself out. It's not gonna have any other artifacts to it. Now, having said that, there are some blocks, maybe the transistor tape delay, which is modeled after a device that had these nonlinear characteristics, meaning if we feed a signal into it, it's going to get one sound coming out of it after it processes it. But if we put a louder signal into it, we're very likely going to get a different result coming back out of it. So it's processing the signal in a non-linear fashion. So a linear block would be something that is not dependent on how high or low the input is to affect how it's going to sound coming out. And a non-linear effect would be something that is very dependent on how much signal it's hit in the front end with. One of the best examples would be an amplifier, any tube amplifier. If we throw a Marshall Plexi model on and hit it, and the best way to describe this is like I described in the first video. If we our first gain stage, our guitar volume, if we turn that down, we get less distortion on the amp. If we turn it up, we get more distortion. Therefore, that's a non-linear processing of the sound, okay? The harder we hit the front end, the more the output changes in the way that block processed the sound, okay? So very important to kind of understand that, and I hope I was clear about that, linear processing versus non-linear processing, okay? So let's go over to Cubase and HX. I'm gonna show you the setup that I have here. What I did actually is, I'll just drag this over onto the screen. In Cubase, I recorded a track out of the USB 7 of the Helix. So meaning just the dry, straight guitar tone. And this is so I don't have to keep playing and recording. So what I've done with this is I've taken this track and I've fed it out a mono output, which I have created kind of like a reamping situation. I have a mono output feeding output 3. So we're going to go over to our Helix and you'll notice that both of these paths are receiving on input 3. So the output of this track here is feeding the input of my 2 Helix paths. I'm then taking the output of path 1 and recording it or monitoring it. I'm not going to do any recording in this case, we don't need to. I'm monitoring it on guitar 1, so this is the first path, and the bottom path is feeding USB 3.4 down here on the second path. And we can see that mono in 3, mono in 1, and over here on my inputs, I have mono in 1, which is input 1, and mono in 3, which is input 3. So I hope that's clear. So basically, Cubase is feeding out of itself into the Helix, same thing to both paths, and then I'm monitoring both paths on separate outputs. So this is going to give me, and I can just get rid of this and use it when I have to. And I also have my Cubase mixer here always on screen so we can look at our meters, and our RMS meters and our peak meters, and I can also flip the phase back and forth to do proper null testing to see if what we're getting is what we're getting. Now, before I go on, I wanted to show you something really interesting. In the first video, if you remember, I couldn't figure why I couldn't get 2 amplifiers with the same settings to null. And I talked to my friends over at Line 6 and I got a pretty good answer to this. So let me just do this. Let's add in a Brit Plexi norm. And I'm just going to copy that and paste it down here. Okay, so now I have the same signal running through the exact same block, just on 2 separate paths. Now, what should happen if I hit play? And I'm really apologize in advance for, you're going to hear this one little repetitive riff over and over again. It's going to be annoying, but it's just for the purpose of seeing the difference between 2 different sounds here. So here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to hear. And that's just going to be looped and looped. Okay, so right now what you're hearing is monitoring of both of these channels at the same time. If I flip and let's do this. Let's mute, or let's turn off both of those blocks. Here's what you're hearing with no processing. Now, as I showed yesterday, if I flip the phase on one of these tracks or channels in Cubase, it's going to cancel that out. We're not going to hear anything. I flip the phase, it's gone. Now you'll notice the meters will just fade away to nothing and we will get minus infinity here on RMS max and peak. That means that the signal that's coming through here is identical. Now what's interesting about it is when I turned these blocks on and play this again, you're hearing this amp model process both of those tracks. But what happens if I flip the phase here? We would think because they're identical, it's just going to cancel itself out. But let's listen to this now, and I'll start playing, then I'll hit the phase on it. Now at first listen, you go, yeah, it's canceled out. But let's wait till the meters come down. If I hit reset the meters, my RMS on this is around minus 92 dB. Now it's not a big deal. You'd have to turn the volume up very loud to hear it, but it's puzzling. We go, why is this not canceling out? We're feeding, this should be the same thing. Well, what I was told by the fine folks at Line 6 is if I turn the hum and the ripple down on both of these, let's do that. Now I'll reset my meters. We notice they now null down closer to minus 117 or 109. And actually, that's the max. So you cannot hear this. These can be considered identical. Now, the reasoning behind this is simply this. Even if we set the hum and ripple back to 5, if I let you hear this and go back and forth between these, let's see if we can do that. There's no difference in the sound, but what's happening when we're playing them together, trying to get them to null, whatever is processing in the hum and the ripple is actually just not in sync with one another. So when we're playing through one on its own, that's not going to make a difference. But when we try to do the null test, it just causes a little bit of an issue. So there's going to be other situations too on the Helix where I'm sure some internal processing of the block, if we're trying to run two at the same time and cancel them out, if there's even the slightest bit out of sync, that's going to show up as not being a perfect null, even though the sound is not actually going to be different. Okay, so something important to keep in mind. So let's get rid of this. I want to do something really interesting because we want to go back to this idea of linear versus non-linear. And I want to give you an example. I'm going to add two gain blocks here. I'm going to put a stereo gain block at the beginning and a stereo gain block at the end. Now, neither of these are doing anything right now. So if I play and flip the phase, again, we see that this just basically disappears down to minus 149 RMS. Like it's doing nothing audible to the sound. Now, what happens if I come in and add 12 dB of gain? We obviously get something back. What I would have to do to compensate for that is lower 12 dB of gain over here. So let's play it again. You'll see how this sound will disappear as I do that. And once again, I'm back down to the same RMS value. So what this shows is I've added two gain stages to my path, yet these are linear processes, right? These aren't adding anything other than very clean gain. They're not adding any distortion characteristics or anything else. So it would be pointless to do this unless the purpose we're dealing with today, but it's not adding or subtracting anything from the sound. Now, the reason I wanted to do this is because I want to take a look at the simple idea of which blocks potentially could be linear and which blocks could be nonlinear. And the reason is, we're going to deal with some reverbs and some delays today, because this is some questions I got about it in that, well, there's going to be a better amount to send into a particular delay. And while there is some truth to that, we want to know which ones are going to be affected more and which ones aren't. In the end, we have to use our ears. It's going to be very hard to clip any of the internal blocks in the Helix digitally. Okay, that's something to keep in mind because of the way that it processes the signal, all right? So I've seen some very bad misinformation about this, especially concerning the vintage delay, or vintage digital delay, which I'm going to show you. But let's start off like this. Let's put a reverb. Let's go with just a legacy reverb, a hall reverb up here. We'll copy and paste that down to here. Now, what should happen, I'm going to turn these gain blocks off. I have one set at plus 12, one at minus 12. So what this is going to show us when we need it is we're going to hit the front end of whatever block is in between hard to see if it adds any kind of non-linear distortion characteristics or changes the tone. And then after the block, we're going to bring that same 12 dB back. So whatever's left is going to be the difference of what that particular block in the middle is doing, if that makes sense, okay? But we'll turn those off for now. What we should have here is two reverbs that cancel themselves out. Now let's start off by bringing the phase back. We'll turn the phase back off, okay, the phase control, and we will start our, we hear signal. What happens when we flip phase? Perfectly canceled out again down to minus 140 dB FS on our RMS meter, okay? So again, the reverb is not adding or subtracting. This is working in sync as we want it to. But what happens if I add 12 dB of gain going into it and take that 12 dB of gain back out on the other side? We're hitting the front of the reverb harder now. We're going to see whether this reverb adds any sort of non-linear distortion characteristics or anything to the sound. And this will tell us whether it's really important to worry about how hard we're hitting this reverb on the front end. Let's say we have this after an amplifier model. Is jacking the channel volume up going to affect the tone of this? Well, let's see, okay? So if we run this again, if I take the phase off, turn the phase on, we are still way down at 140-ish, minus 140 or so dBFS. This is not, no matter how hard we're hitting this, I shouldn't say no matter how hard, but we're adding a lot of gain back into the front end of this, 12 dB. It's still not affecting it. This is a very linear effect, we can tell, right? Okay, so that's good. We know about the Hall reverb. Well, let's come out of the Hall reverb and let's take something more complex. Let's come in and go to a stereo Glitz reverb, something that will have a little more going on within it. We'll turn these gain blocks off. We'll see if these null, or if there's something within the internal processing which not letting them. So here we go. This is with the phase off. Let me flip the phase now. So we see some remainder sound. So there's something going on in the processing between these two blocks internally that's not in sync with one another. So we get a little remainder, but it's around minus 48.4. So that's our baseline. What happens when I hit the front of that with 12 dB more gain and then take it away on the other side? Let's see what happens. And I'll just zero this off and we see absolutely nothing happens. So again, this is more of a linear type of a process. It's not adding anything different to the sound depending on how hard we hit the front end with it. So that's good to know. So it seems to me that, and obviously without going through every single reverb, I don't know which ones are going to be perfectly linear or non-linear. You would have to try this same little test on your own to hear which blocks do, what to the sound, right? And obviously, we would want to adjust accordingly. So for those reverbs, it really doesn't make a difference. So let's get rid of those. And now let's go to something like the vintage digital delay. Okay, because I saw a video at one point about this where it was claimed that it was adding digital distortion because we were clipping it too hard. The problem is, on the initial setting of this, when we just pull it up, it's designed to digitally clip. You got to realize something. All I'm doing is feeding the basic signal of my guitar, unamplified guitar into it. That is not considered a super hot signal, right? It's actually, if we bypass everything here and feed this signal through, we're getting RMS of minus 33 dBFS and a peak of minus 12, okay? That's not a hot signal. That shouldn't be digitally distorting anything. But something interesting happens here when we plummet through the vintage digital delay. And let's listen to that. Do you hear the clipping? It's not nice. That's digital distortion. But that's not because it's not supposed to be doing that. That has actually been modeled into the vintage digital delay. Okay, that's part of what it's supposed to do. So this idea that it's not supposed to do that, now, whether you want that or not is different, but within the processing of the vintage digital delay block, we can get rid of that. The reason is its bit depth is set to 12. As we lower the bit depth, and watch as I play that and listen as I lower the bit depth, we get these awful digital artifacts, but this is called the vintage digital delay. They're actually modeling the digital artifacts. If I go up to 24 bits, watch what happens. Problem solved. I've created more headroom within the processing of that particular block. Okay, where does that clipping start getting introduced? right at the 14-bit setting. 24 is fine, 16 is fine. So let's go back to 12 and say, well, how do we deal with that? Well, I'm going to play this again, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the headroom control to see if we can get rid of that digital distortion. So by giving it 4 or 5 dB more headroom within the particular block, it solves that problem. What happens if I go down to 8 on the bit depth? So it seems about 4.5 to 5 dB of headroom solves that problem for us, and we get rid of that. So don't be fooled by misinformation in videos on the internet. There's some really awful information out there, and you gotta really take a lot of it with a grain of salt. So we have to realize that some of these things are designed to do that. So if we have an amp model in front of this, and we have our channel volume set to get our preset working exactly how we want it to, and we throw a vintage digital in and it causes this problem, it's not really the problem we think it is. I wouldn't go messing with the channel volume going into it unless we absolutely need to. You're very likely going to be able to get rid of that with the bit depth setting, but I mean the bit depth is going to give a certain sound, so you should be able to probably use the headroom control just as easily to get rid of those unwanted artifacts which are part of what's modeled into this particular block. Does that make sense? Okay, I hope it does, because I really want to clear up some of the misinformation that's been put out by others in the videos that they've put out concerning this. Okay, so what if we do, though, take this and just to get the settings back, I'll just paste that same one back down. Make sure that, now we know that this is going to clip, so let's do this. Let's just bring the headroom up around 6 on both. Okay, so now if I just listen to one of these again. Okay, we're fine, we're not getting the clipping. What if I jam 12 dB more volume into the front of it and then take that same 12 dB out? So I would say this is going to clip it quite badly. Is that something we can get rid of with the headroom? Well, possibly. Let's try it out. It most certainly lessens it, but it doesn't get rid of it. So we could also adjust the bit depth. So even with hitting 12 dB of extra gain into the vintage digital delay, we can still get rid of a lot of that with the, well, I mean, obviously with the bit depth control and the headroom control. But I mean, if we really have our heart set on having this set at 11 on the bit depth and we've maxed out our headroom, then at that point you are going to have to come an inch back, do the proper gain staging so you're getting what you want out of that delay. So that's really how that delay is working. And whether they null or not is really not important, because we already know that by feeding more gain into it, it's very easy to hear that it's a very non-linear process, but it's designed like that. Let's do one more. Let's take a look at one of my favorite delays. We'll deal with the stereo transistor tape. Copy that and paste it down here. And let's do this. Let's see if these null, first of all, when they're identical settings, which they are right now. Okay, so we'll come back over here to get my setup going. I'll flip my phase. Now interesting, we're down around minus 60 on our RMS dBFS scale. I'm guessing, kind of like with the amp example I gave you earlier, if I take the wow and flutter and the spread down, let's try the wow and flutter on both. Now we get a better null. So something with the wow and flutter between the two aren't in sync when played at the same time. What if we take the spread down? I don't know if that's going to have a heck of a lot of effect. It really does. Now we're nulling these down to 103.2. Pretty crazy. So let's use that kind of as a baseline here and see what else. Actually, let's do this. Let's bring the wow and flutter back up to about 2.3 just to... And we'll put the spread up around 2. Oh no, and I hope I got the settings identical between them. Okay, so what we're ending up with is it's null down to a minus 60. Okay, so let's see what happens when we jam 12 dB more signal into the front end of that, and then we'll cut it by 12 dB on the other side, and we'll see if these still null. So we can clearly hear how hitting the front end of the transistor tape is actually causing more of this nonlinear distortion. Don't let anybody tell you you're hitting that and it's causing digital distortion. It's not. This is modeled into the actual block. And from what I know from the folks at Line 6, they model these very accurately. It's probably very much like a real version of this model in the real physical world would react as well. Now, having said that though, if we take these two, turn off the phase and say, how much of a difference is that actually making in the real world? Imagine we have an amplifier before this, right? And we A/B compare the two sounds. So for instance, here's the sound of, and I'll get rid of this phase here. Here's the sound of this first path by itself. Now I'll switch to the other path. You see what I mean? Like, yes, there's a difference scientifically. You know, there's some distortion characteristics somewhere 45, 50 dB below full scale. And you go, okay, that's fine. So yes, you know, how hard we hit the front of this matters. But in a real world scenario where we have an amplifier in front of this, then hitting that, if we crank more gain into it, is it going to destroy our sound? It's not going to clip it digitally. So are we adding a little bit of nonlinear distortion from that block by going a little harder into it? Yes. Are we going to notice it? I would likely say that a lot of times we aren't. You know, imagine a really distorted amp going into that. It's going to kind of blend in. Imagine putting that in a mix. Is it going to make a big difference? Well, that's going to be up to you to decide, right? Use your ears. The point is going into delays and reverbs like that, we're probably not going to destroy the sound by adding a little more input gain within the Helix, right? So we really have to understand this idea about linear versus nonlinear processing. So again, a linear block is not going to be dependent on how much input we put into it to change the sound of the output, let's put it, unless we push it into digital distortion. But like I said, it's not going to really happen too easily in the Helix. But a nonlinear block absolutely will. The harder we hit the front of it, like an amplifier, like anything with tubes, right? Like a compressor. All of those things, we have to be very mindful of how much we put into it, how much signal we put into it. But again, you know, maybe hitting the front end of it harder is what we want. I used the example in the last video about recording to tape in the studio. You know, one of the oldest tricks was to run it very hot. As we run the tape, hit the tape harder with more signal, we get a very pleasant, sweet distortion sound that actually makes things like drums and other instruments sound better. There's actually digital modeling of tape distortion characteristics to mimic that now. So it shows you that's a good thing. Obviously, there's a limit to how far we can push that. So again, what we're trying to do with gain staging is we're trying to maximize our signal to noise ratio. We are trying to avoid obvious, terrible artifacts. So, you know, we want to get a hot enough signal that our signal to noise ratio is where we need it to be. We don't want it so hot that we're going to cause adverse effects such as digital distortion. But having said that, we also want to be aware that sometimes adding a little bit more gain going into a certain type of effect gives it a sweeter, nicer sound, which excellent, that could be great. Or maybe it's not what you want. So I can't sit here and give you all the answers of what's right and what's wrong. I just want to give you the information that shows you how these things work. And I thought that this way and the way I did it in the last video was a very scientific approach. Rather than just hearing somebody spew out about how the vintage digital delay, you're hitting it the front end too hard because of, you know, your channel volume on your amp was too high, therefore that's why there's digital distortion. No, there isn't digital distortion. Well, there is digital distortion, but it's digital distortion that's being modeled to sound that way. And there's ways to rectify that within the block itself with the headroom control, the bit depth and whatnot, right? Maybe you are just hitting it with too much input gain for whatever the purpose is. So again, it's all about gain stage. There's no true sort of right and wrong. It really depends on the scenario. But I thought this was an important video to do just so you could understand this a little bit more. And I truly do believe these two videos are two of the most important videos I have done, because if we're not gain staging properly, as we see here, we can get a lot of adverse effects. We can get a lot of different effects, right? Maybe for the better. Maybe we didn't realize that if we hit the transistor tape harder, it has more of a nonlinear distortion. And maybe now that we know that, we're going to try to hit it harder because we like the sound of that. Or maybe we don't even notice. Who knows, right? In the real world, if we're feeding our Helix into real world mic preamps, you know, there's some preamps that are going to be very nonlinear. Others are going to be much more linear, where it doesn't color the sound in any way. There's going to be other mic preamps that the harder we hit them, the sweeter the sound is. They add sort of a nice nonlinear distortion, and then we crank the input up on them and we turn the output down, and we get the sweetness of hitting the front end hard but not overloading anything after it, right? So it gets complicated, but at the same time it's really not that complicated once we get the idea of the signal chain in our mind and what is happening when we hit that block. And the funny thing is, in a video like this, I can't say, oh, always do this, because, well, the question is, well, what are you going into? Okay, now the question is, well, what effect does hitting this block harder or softer have? In some cases, the answer is it doesn't do anything. Fine, just avoid digital clipping, try to get a good signal noise ratio. In other cases, well, when we hit this harder, the tone changes, we get more distortion, but maybe a nice distortion, maybe a bad distortion. And that's up to us to decide how hard or how soft we go into it. And this can really help us go a long way in improving the sound of our presets. I hope that was clear, and I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope I didn't kind of get off explaining things in a way that was not clear. But please comment and leave me some questions on it. I'm really going to try to answer them all. I don't have the time to answer all of them. I really do appreciate you guys and the comments that you leave and the questions you give me, and I apologize when I can't get back to you on them. Thank you so much for watching. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. Share the video also with anybody who you think will get use out of it, and I think it's a very important topic. So thanks again for tuning in, guys. Thanks for the support. Ciao for now. I'll be back soon.